a time slip is not the same as time travel. A time slip is definitely difficult to not only understand, but to try and explain. For the few reported cases of time slip, and those that have been investigated, time slips would likely be more common when there are multiple witnesses. When you have one person claiming a strange occurrence of being in a different time, it is difficult to prove or even have a verification of any of the points. This means that there may be many single-person occurrences of time slip. But without validation of another party, they are ignored for the most part. One of the most famous cases involved 3 15-year-old young men who had all 3 recently signed up for the Royal Navy. The boys were in the United Kingdom, near a village called Kersey. The year was 1957, and the 3 had been sent out for a simple map reading training exercise. The 3 cadets, William Lang, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker, were given one objective for this training exercise. They were to walk a scenic route, look for the several assigned locations that they had been given. Then they were to map a route to the waypoint and make notes of all that they had observed. They would simply return and take the notes to their superior officers. The 3 thought that this was going to be a simple and generalized task to be done on a beautiful and sunny day. But along their route, the day took a turn to the strange side. As they walked, they came to the small hamlet or town of Kersey. They continued on their way to the village, but this is when things began to turn very strange. They all noticed the silence enveloping them. The church bells had seemed to instantly stop ringing. The wind appeared to have stopped, and even the birds singing was no longer able to be heard. There was no movement of the fallen leaves along the ground. The tiny branches were not moving even a slight bit. What made this little walk they were on even stranger is that the ducks in a nearby pond were no longer moving. It was as if they were stuck in a place, frozen in the exact spot that they were. There was no person, no child, no sign of anyone in the town or on the streets. For a nice day, there was no sign of any smoke churning out of the chimneys. It was as if they had come across an entirely deserted town. William Lang actually thought it was like a ghost town, a place they had somehow walked into from back in time. He felt sadness overwhelming him and a depression weighing heavily on his shoulders. There was also an eerie feeling of being watched, as if there were unseen forces standing in the shadows, watching them. He did not feel as if this was a friendly location they were in. William Lang claimed to have an unnerving sense of unfriendliness and invisible watchers, which gave him chills. He later pondered what could have happened if they had knocked on a door to ask a question. The very concept of it made him terribly anxious. The 3 considered walking up to a car to see who, if anyone, would answer the door to them. Another strange aspect the 3 noticed is there were no cars, no vehicles of any type, including bicycles. They saw no wires for electrical or phones. Until that moment, they had not realized that although they knew this was considered one of the older hamlets in the era, the street was not a paved street. This one had cobblestones and seemed like those you would see from many years before, old-fashioned. The hamlet of Kersey was known for having very old buildings. These, however, seemed to be ancient, as though they were medieval buildings. That would be normal in towns that continue to keep their historic buildings in good condition. Here, however, no matter where you would look, there was not a single modern-looking building. They could tell the buildings around them were all hand-built, framed with rough sawn timbers. The windows had a sort of grimy appearance, as though they were covered in grime and dirt. But the weirdness continued. The season seems to have changed drastically just since they arrived. It had been the fall seasons, where the trees were still green, but it was more of the green you would see in spring, with freshly sprouted leaves. They walked over with the intention of approaching one of the smaller buildings. It seemed to be deserted, but they looked through the windows where they could, and noticed that it appeared to be a shop where the butcher would cut meat. This is how one of the cadets phrased it. He saw no counters, no tables or chairs. There were just carcasses that had been skinned. However, they were turning green with age. There was a door painted green, and some windows that had small panes of glass in them. There was one window in the front and one on the side of the room. They were quite filthy looking. Again, they were looking at the carcasses. They were becoming very green and moldy. All three of them had an uneasy feeling of uncertainty, disbelief, and that this was just not real. They could not believe that any held authority would allow this kind of a situation. Moldy meat, filthy inside of the apparent butcher shop. They moved along to some of the other buildings and found that although they appeared to be private residences, they were vacant. There were no furniture, no humans, and no sign of life whatsoever within these buildings. As they had neared the hamlet, they had all seen smoke coming from some of the chimneys. How were they able to remove all signs of life, all possessions so quickly? They then decided to go look for the church tower that they had seen as they were approaching. The church tower was considered to be a major landmark, and the three cadets knew that they would be able to gather their thoughts and collect their bearings, so to speak. However, as the three approached where it was, they were extremely shocked to see that it was not there. It was as if it had never been there. They all knew that they had seen it from the outskirts of the town, and according to all information, it was not only a historic landmark, but also the most famous building there. There were so many questions. Where had the church gone? Where were all the people and their belongings? The three Navy cadets began to feel spooked and unsettled. It was as though this hamlet had a sense of dread all over it, and it was coming after the three cadets. The three decided to leave as soon as they possibly could. They had gathered as much of the information as they could that had been instructed to them. They left down the same path and the same road that they had entered on. As they walked further away, they would turn and were shocked to find that everything had returned to normal. There was wind rustling the branches and leaves, and there was once again smoke coming from the chimneys. And again, the church tower was right there where it had been when they first approached and entered the hamlet. The superior officers had confirmed that the three cadets had indeed reached their destination. However, they ignored and acted as though the remainder of their statements was bogus, and that they made it all up. They had all brushed the details, the strangeness, and the oddities off. And the cadets? Well, they pushed all that to the backs of their minds. For now. During the 1980s, a paranormal researcher named Andrew Mackenzie became intrigued with the instance when he received the first letter from Lang and Crowley. These were two of the cadets that had been through it. He had made a decision to go meet with the two men, and then after hearing them speak, they all went to the same village where this had happened. After listening to them before the trip to the village, while they were at the village, Mackenzie became convinced that something strange had happened to the three young cadets. Andrew Mackenzie recognized the two cadets minus Ray Baker had been through what is called retrocognition. It is the ability to know something about the past that could not have been learned in any other way. It is the supernatural ability of being able to see into the past. Andrew Mackenzie is a long-standing member of the Society of Psychical Research. This was one of those circumstances he had only heard of a handful of other times. The first aspect of the tale he had heard from Lang and Crowley was actually very accurate historically. For one example, the building where they had seen the carcasses was indeed a butcher shop at one time. In 1957, however, that building had been a private dwelling for a family. The observation the cadets had made were accurate as far as the layout of the town. These cadets would not have been able to know the layout they had repeated. It was then that Andrew Mackenzie had come to the conclusion that the three cadets had truly traveled through what he called a time slip. Mackenzie did not stop at just accepting their relation of what they had seen. He went even further and made the attempt of what era they had been to. He determined that due to the village being deserted and the church tower had not been visible to the young men. This was apparently before the tower had been completed. The village had likely been ravaged by the Black Death, so his estimate was that it was sometime in the early 1400s. Andrew Mackenzie had been so impressed by all that they had told him, including as they went through the village, that he ultimately wrote a book about it. The book is called Adventures in Time. However, you know this little tale of time slip cannot be finished unless we mention the skeptics. In this one, of course, they state that the glass for window panes would have been extremely expensive in that period of time. They also state that a butcher shop would have been highly unlikely in such a small village. The logic for the skeptics is that meat would have been a luxury in such a small town. However, again, the fight can be put towards the statement about meat. Many folks raised their own cattle so that they would have meat then. They state that meat would have been far more common in a larger town. Another point made by the skeptics is that the three cadets did not see wires for the electrical and phone service, as they were generally strung behind the homes, and only one era would have been dug to lay the wires or cables, where they were meant to cross the era of the cobblestone street. Ultimately, what this comes down to is that there is no definitive proof or evidence other than the words of the two of the cadets. The third cadet had ultimately pushed the experience so far back in his mind that there was no memory of the episode. Do you find it possible that there was a time slip that the three young cadets of the British Royal Navy slipped through? Or is it just some story that they developed to cover the tracks that they did not actually do what they were supposed to have done?